I am going to basically walk us through this slide deck that more or less is like a general career talk of how I ended up where I'm at right now. So big trajectory. Right now I work for Bio-Rad Laboratories, which is a biotechnology company based in Hercules, California. I do basically curriculum and training support for teachers and professors that are using Bio-Rad equipment to teach molecular biology, cell biology, and these other biotechy things in their classroom. Prior to that, though, I worked at the national labs. Prior to that, I was a high school teacher. So we're going to go through all of those to some degree, why I was there, how I ended up there, what I learned from them, and what the next moves are. And very importantly, how does one manage one's time when you have a lot of stuff going on? Because that seemed to be one of the biggest questions. I grew up in Calaveras County, California. Usually I go to a classroom and ask, how many of you guys know what that is? Nobody raises their hand. Maybe one off person raises their hand. It's in the middle of nowhere in California, also known as the Western Slope of the Sierra Nevada. Just for like scale, like we had one stoplight in the entire county that I grew up in. Our major economy was based upon a Mark Twain story where two guys get drunk in a bar and bet on how far their frogs can jump. That now has become like a 4-day festival in the county that is one of the biggest moneymakers. So you can imagine the job opportunities there are kind of small. So when you're in high school, you're thinking, what do I do if I want to stay here? And then what do I do if I need to get out of here? And so I would say the most important classes I took in Calaveras High School was actually a CTE program, kind of similar to what you guys are in, or as far as like an academic program that's very focused on getting you skills ultimately. ROP Medical was linked with the local, basically, hospital. So I ended up working with a thoracic surgeon every day of the week before school. So I took a 0 period. I'd come in, I'd work in his office, and then go back and then go take my classes at Calaveras High. Since I thought I was going to medical school, you do all the things to get you ready to go into that, med program like at a college. And so that's taking the AP courses and trying to stay really high up in the math and in the sciences. So I'd say the biggest classes I benefited from in high school ended up being my chemistry course, my calculus course, economics, and then really that ROP medical. And it wasn't because I learned what I needed to get into medical school. I actually learned that I didn't want to go that route, which was super, super valuable. And that's one of those big things I'll kind of come back and see a couple times throughout this career talk. I definitely was, like if you think about extracurriculars, it also kind of positions you into which kind of clique you belong in high school. Like I was all over the board, enough so that like, I'd hang out with like, the nerdy group, but then I'd also hang out with some of the jocks. Mainly we'd make fun of the jocks because they're the football guys, the soccer guys were tougher. But all that you kind of get shuffled around socially, which was actually really good. It ended up being my first experience in networking was the extracurricular stuff I tried doing in high school. And that network, I still get feedback and payment off of that up until this day, which is kind of amazing. People I met through these activities, I've had help me with business transactions and things like that up until just a couple years ago. High school jobs. These you also learn a lot from. Usually at high school, you're learning what things do I not like and how do I avoid having this job for the rest of my life. So my list of not likes that I don't want to have the rest of my life were moving cattle. Actually, it was kind of fun to start with. You're outside, it's really cool until your best buddy, gets ground into the ground by a cow and breaks, his clavicle and a couple ribs. And you're like, oh yeah, long-term job prospect. Like below minimum wage. Probably not my thing. And then of course, the typical high school one of like, mowing lawns, doing physical labor, like brush clearing, stuff like that, installing fences, which mainly you learn a lot of tools that you'll use, like if you ever become a homeowner in your life, and you also learn just what like real blood, sweat, and tears is like to earn a paycheck. But maybe something if you can avoid doing for the rest of your life, you would probably pivot away from. And then also selling rocks. So I also used to dig up rocks as a kid and then sell them at this giant rock festival that happened in Calaveras County. So if you're ever in like, the need or look for like some quartz crystals, I can help you out. But it also, those actually helped me understand kind of like business stuff, because for the first time that selling rocks, I learned all of like inventory and supply and pricing, all that type of stuff, which actually really benefited me going into other jobs when I got into college and things like that. high school, the biggest lessons learned is if there's a career I think I want to have, I have to get hands-on experience like ASAP. And like, so say you're like, I want to be a doctor. You can't just go in and be like, hey, could I be the doctor this week? No, no one's going to let you do that, but you could go in, you could do like what I was doing, which was working at a clinic. And you get to see how that operates. You get to see that career position you're looking at and understand what education does it take to get there? Or actually before that, do I even like this? Does this even hit my expectations of what this job was? So in high school, ER was like the hot TV program. So everyone wanted to go into medicine. Everybody wanted to be a doctor because it looked really sexy based upon, George Clooney and all these other people like acting it up. But then you go in there and I was like, you know what? I do like some aspects of medicine. I like the applied science for community good, but I do not like a clinical environment. Like I just feel like always kind of creepy and icky, like in a hospital. So I was like, how do I get the good from that job, but not the bad? So where are the places could I go to get applied science that does community good, but not necessarily in a hospital clinical environment? Also, what I learned from that is networking is really, really important. Some of these networks I built in high school just by those extracurricular activities, like I said, still benefit me to this day. And when you try to get hands-on education or hands-on experience with that thing you think you want a career in, you learn really quickly what things you need that are skills and what things you need that are degrees, pedigrees, education. And those aren't always the same thing, which is something that is a really important thing to recognize. Skills are not always the same as an education like piece of paper. So you need to focus on both of those no matter what your next kind of educational step is in life. Be like, I'm getting the piece of paper, but what skills am I walking out here with? Because that's what people that hire you really look at. They're like, cool, you got a master's in this, but can you clone this bacteria for me? Can you do PCR for me? They really want that. And so really focusing on the skills is really, really important. So from from high school in Calaveras County, I ended up at St. Mary's College in Moraga, California. I ended up there mainly because I applied to a whole bunch of different universities and colleges when I was in high school. I went and tried to visit as many of them as I could my junior year. Me and my buddy actually took my mom's van, lived in it for a week, and drove and hit as many colleges as we could on the West Coast, which was a great experience, and I'm surprised we didn't get in jail. But you learn really quickly that these campuses all teach or go about education very, very differently. I always thought I wanted to go to UC Berkeley because growing up in the sticks, like that is like the big city school that everyone knows about. So you're like, well, that must be where I want to go. I went there and like sat in on a general chemistry class and was like, this isn't for me. Like I don't learn. I'm in a class of 400 people and there's like a grad student on a small stage talking to me. St. Mary's though was very different. When I went in there, it was like roundtable discussion style for like all of their classes, even chemistry and stuff like that. So it was a much more dynamic learning environment. I was like, yeah, I would like to end up there. So now let's put out the apps, go for the financial aid, and then make that decision weighing all of those things, like the type of education I want, but also what that financial aid package looks like. And I got lucky and St. Mary's offered me a pretty good financial aid package. So I bid on that and I went there and I really, really enjoyed my time there. So I started off as an English chemistry major, which are two things that one should never try to accomplish at the same time. Writing really long essays and doing really long labs, they eat up all of your time. So by, sophomore year, I realized that I had dug myself the world's biggest academic hole and needed to jump out. And so I went, you know what, I'm gonna double down on the science because I know I like that. I know it's gonna be easier to land a job when I'm out of here with a science degree than anything else. So I went and I got a biology chemistry split major and then ended up minoring in philosophy to kind of cover that stuff that I did like about English. The beauty about that small school is you had direct contact with PhDs all the time. So for example, my molecular biology class, I had 6 people in it. I brought the orange juice, the prof brought the bagels. Like we literally just brought breakfast every morning and then talked molecular biology. That's half the reason probably I ended up going into molecular biology as a profession was because I had such a good working grasp of it by a really kind of beginner class at this college. So getting those really kind of tight experiences where you can learn are really, really valuable. In college, always also keep all those extracurriculars, right? Because that's what helps you build that network. And so I had that photography background from high school, mainly because I wanted to apply to UC Berkeley and you needed to have an art class. And I can't draw, even though my mom was the art teacher at the middle school. So I was like, you know what? Photography is my art. It's basically just chemistry, so I could own this. And I actually really liked it. It was a different way to like see the world. It made me have different perspectives on things that I wouldn't have seen otherwise, because photography asks you to see things differently and then capture those things. So I ended up with that skill set coming out of high school. And so when I went into college, I was just like, maybe I'll try to like just, you know, work on the yearbook or newspaper just from like some extra money and to network. I walked in with my portfolio and they said, do you want to be the editor, the photo editor? Like, and I was like a freshman and I was kind of like, how much does it pay? And they're like, $500 a semester. And I was like, I didn't know anything at that time. And I was like, yeah, that sounds good. It was like $2 an hour is what it came down to. But it was really great because with this role, I met everyone on campus. I knew every professor on that campus and probably like 70% of the students, which means that if I ever had a question about anything, I could literally just dial a number and I would get my local expert on it. So that network, again, grew out like my capacity of what I could get involved with and what I could understand. And in fact, one of these people, my newspaper editor from my senior year, ends up being the person that lands me the job on the Human Genome Project. And we'll circle back to that. And I did photography for local magazines, but then the big one, I think, was getting an internship my junior year at the National Institutes of Health, which is in Washington, D.C. It's actually in Bethesda, Maryland. And this was my first like deep dive into being a primary researcher. And so this was that applied science, right, for community good. Because if you work on stuff as a scientist and you discover like a new pathway or a new drug, all of a sudden you're helping tons of many more people than a doctor ever helps in their entire life, because a doctor's kind of like a high-end technician. They're just going to help the number of people that they interact with in their lifetime, and that's it. As a scientist, you can actually help people that you'll never meet, and after you're gone, people can still be getting use out of things that you worked on. I met really important people from my network by doing that. I got paid really well for doing it. And NIH has a program for high school students. And so if you're really interested in the sciences, it's one you should look at. They've got one also for college and for post-college. The beauty of it is it's one of the largest research centers in the world. So you will get to see stuff there that you've only read about and only dreamed about, and you can actually go up and talk to the experts about it and say, how'd you get involved in this? You know, what about this? You can ask questions, all that type of stuff. Really, really important. So this is what changed my career trajectory. And this is junior year. Actually, it's like between junior and senior year in college, right? So you don't have to have it all figured out. You just gotta kind of know what things you like, what things you don't like, and keep shifting your basically career trajectory to get you there. So I realized primary science is where I want to go. However, though, because St. Mary's had given me such a good ride as far as scholarship goes, when I graduated my senior year, I was like, okay, I want to go to grad school to basically become a researcher. But I also want to give back because, I mean, I basically got probably on the order of like $40,000 to $50,000 of scholarship money by the time my 4 years was over. And so St. Mary's had a program that's kind of like AmeriCorps, but it's for their specific kind of schools. And so I ended up going and being a full-time volunteer teacher for a year in Portland, Oregon, got a brand new school off the ground. And it was intense. Hardest job I've ever had by far, especially when you've got multiple subjects you're supposed to cover. Maybe you don't know those subjects really well, and it's your first time teaching them. And you guys know how tough you are on your teachers, right? Like with all those like questions and giving them a hard time, like you want to be on top of your game when you show up in that classroom. And so I'd be up until like 1 a.m. every night, just trying to make sure I had everything together for the next day. I taught algebra, I taught photography, journalism, yearbook, and totally unqualified. But because I was the youngest person on staff, they're like, Damon, you're the computer science guy. You're teaching computers. We don't have computers for you, but we got these ones off of Craigslist that somebody was throwing away. So I was just like, oh my God, super hard, but also by far the most rewarding job I've ever had. Like all these people you see in these photographs here, these are my students, all 72 of them from the first year class at De La Salle. I think I still get yearly communication from at least like half of these. You know, one of them like actually slept on my couch for 6 months, like 5 years ago, just so that, because he was trying to get into a master's of public health program down in the Bay Area. He just had like, he just gave birth, or his wife just gave birth to like 2 kids. He's now a big public health official in the Bay Area. He moved down here from Portland. He wants to eventually move back to Ghana, where he's from, to start a whole line of like clinics there. I mean, it's just, and all I'm doing is just giving small supportive help, right? But you guys know, like in like high school, somebody answers the right question for you or just kind of like connects you with the right people. It can completely change like what you think about what you're doing in your life. And so this was by far one of the most rewarding experiences I had. I didn't stay though, because I did have student loans still. And when they wanted to hire me full time, I was like, okay, well, you know, we got to do the uncomfortable stuff. We got to talk numbers. So how much? And they're like, well, we can pay you about $22,000 a year. And I was like, ooh, I mean, I can barely cover my housing, my food, let alone student loans. I know I still want to go back and become a researcher at some point. So I've got to say goodbye, and I'm going to do that transition to kind of get myself back on that research route. And so I ended up in the Bay Area, figuring I needed to get a little bit more lab experience under my belt in order to make me a really good candidate for a PhD program. And so I basically moved from Portland down to the San Francisco Bay Area, and then just started the grunt push of I've got a resume and I'm going to every place I know with it. And it was painful, scary, rough. And it was a week of that, you know, like it's not forever, but it just feels like you're just like, you just have to get used to no's everywhere, you know, no, 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 no. And then at one point I get a call on a Friday and some recruiter calls me. He's like, hey, I got your resume. I've got a job for you. Can you be someplace Monday morning at 8 a.m. in Walnut Creek? And I was like, yeah, I can do that. I show up and it's this place called the Joint Genome Institute. And my first job is going to be like what a lot of MoBio first jobs is. They're like, here's your pipette. There's a bunch of samples over there that we need gel electrophoresis done on. And I'm just like, okay, let's do it. And I ended up coming in as basically a quality control technician was my first role there, which meant running. I started off, they were having us sample and run about 200 samples per day. So imagine pouring gels for that and running those, imaging them and analyzing them. I then realized that from a statistical point of view, that wasn't good. And we were actually missing things. We're causing the taxpayer to basically pay a bunch of money on reactions that were not going to work. And so I ended up scaling that up to the point where we were doing 800 individual samples out onto gels per day. So a lot of this came down to automation and things like that. But basically, you start off someplace low, you slowly show them how you can make things better, and people start opening doors for you at places. In the process of this though, before I got too far into my next role there, I get a phone call from my old college newspaper editor. And Laura's like, hey, Damon, I haven't talked to you in a couple of years since graduation. How's that job at the Joint Genome Institute going, working on the Human Genome Project? And I was like, wait, how did you know about this? And she's like, I got you that job. Wait, what? I got the job. She's like, well, yeah, you kind of did. She's like, I saw your resume on my fiance's floor, and he's a recruiter for Aerotech. And she's like, oh man, that guy, he works his butt off. He will figure stuff out. He'll make it happen. You should try and get him a job. And like between her saying that, him picking that up, I had a job basically within about 24 hours. So it's that network, growing that network, because you never know who in your network is connected to those things you actually want to do. The Human Genome Project was something I was fascinated with in college. And so this was like kind of like my dream job in here. And so I started basically there. Ended up managing about $2 million worth of product, like reagents coming into the facility, testing them, making sure that reactions, things like that were going to run. I took a break, not a break, but like I would take breaks during the summer to run a secondary job as a wedding photographer, just to keep those photography skills alive, which are useful to have those complementary skill sets alive, because that wedding photographer stuff and all that photography stuff actually the national labs got a lot of use out of that because I would do a lot of their promo photographs around the Human Genome Project from our facility. And also, once again, this is another one of those jobs that greatly expands my network. Going to weddings, you meet people from all over the place. You tell them what you do, what you're interested in. Pretty soon you got connections to new jobs and new opportunities. I also kind of took a break from the human genome, went back to school, went to grad school to work on science filmmaking. My reason I pivoted to go there was when I was, as a high school teacher, I saw how influenced my students were by film. You know, you could kind of reach like, you know, a good portion of the students like through interpersonal communication, but film like just had this grip on them that was just amazing. And it was a great way to kind of get information out in the world. And so I thought, well, maybe, you know what, maybe I don't want to go into research right away. I want to take some of this research stuff I've worked on at the Human Genome Project, translate it into films for people so people can actually understand a lot of the kind of bioethics and things like that that are going to be coming on board really quickly as these genomic technologies take off. So Montana had this program built by Discovery Channel to basically make filmmakers out of scientists. And so I joined that thinking, great, I can start translating this stuff out into the world. But really quickly, I learned I wasn't learning the things I wanted to from this. And I was paying out-of-state tuition. So I pretty quickly pivoted and said, I see this being a giant like debt that I'm never going to be able to get out of. And I saw this change in technology was taking place. You know, smartphones are just starting to come out. You could start shooting maybe like a movie on your phone instead of like all this really expensive equipment. So I pivoted out and said, you know what, I'm going to go back to the bench. So I went back to basically the bench into the back of the Joint Genome Institute, and they picked me up and said, hey, man, we're really glad to have you back. We've got some really big projects now we want you to work on. We want you to figure out how to take single cells from the environment, one cell, and be able to get an entire genome out of those. And so I ended up spending a good 5 years working on projects around that. We published the first paper on how to take a single microbial cell, open it up, get all of the DNA out, amplify it to enough DNA where you could work with it and get the entire genome back. Why is that a big thing? 2% of the species on the planet right now currently have a name. The 98% of species on the planet, we probably have barely kind of seen because they're microbes. We can't culture them, which means we can't study them. And so this technique basically opens up that door for us to see the rest of the biodiversity on the planet using a genomic lens. So using this genomic lens after a lot of really interesting projects like understanding how cows break down basically biomass to turn it into sugars, because if we could do that, we could have a really robust biofuel economy. Same thing with the hoatzin, the stink bird from South America. Same thing with termites. Also worked on stuff from like Deepwater Horizon, understanding the bacteria that broke down the oil from that spill, all kinds of stuff. This is what it actually looked like. This is what the tools looked like. So I would dissect things. So actually this is the first organism that ever had a full genome of a bacteria. We took a bacteria from inside the bacteriome of a green-winged sharpshooter. So basically I dissected that on a microscope, and then using a microscope with a really small capillary, I could go in and capture individual bacterial cells, which then I would move to PCR tubes, which then I'd lyse, open up, and then amplify the genome and then try to sequence them. So a lot of kind of techniques came in line here, but you can see right again, there's those photography skills getting used again. See that green wing sharpshooter photos? Those are done by me. That became all the publication data photographs were by me. So those things really came into being helpful. In the background though, because I just moved here from Montana, the Bay Area is really expensive when you move from having like, I don't know, a 2-bedroom for $200 in Montana. And all of a sudden you're like, what can I get for $200? And people are like, a place to park your car. So when I moved back, I was like, I need to avoid that financial hurdle in order to work in this research role that I know I'm not going to make a lot of money at. So I basically applied to become a building manager. And so in the background right now, I still manage this 26-unit apartment complex, which was A, good again for networking, B, really good for like building community. And then also it forced me to learn a lot of things that I will use once I have my own home, a lot of repair work and things like that. But the biggest thing for me is that it also kind of uses a completely different part of my brain than the research world did, because I have to like interact with people at a constant level, not on data, but on kind of personal levels about problems. Where in the research world, you're communicating a lot, but it's very data driven. And the soft skills, the human interpersonal skills are a little bit lower down on the pile. And that's why science, basically conferences are notorious for having some very awkward interactions. In this process though, I realized that I was missing skills from my academic education. I somehow got through a biology chemistry degree without statistics, and that was super missing in my skill set. So I went back to UC Berkeley while I was working at the Joint Genome Institute, picked up that stats class, and then was like, I kind of like this, doing this, like, you know, one course at a time, evenings every once in a while. I'll pick up some of these other biology things I missed that I was interested in. And then pretty soon I was like, I actually kind of like the stats and some of the business stuff that was there. And I realized that business, even though I really hated the idea of it in college, it is really, there's some really useful skill sets in there, no matter where you end up in life. So you know what? JGI said, hey, we'll pay for you to get basically a certificate in business administration because it would make you a better employee for us. So I said, you're footing the bill. I just have to put in the time. I'll do that. So I got basically a certificate in business administration. So I learned like marketing, more statistics, more economics, all of these things that actually really helped me in my role at JGI, especially when I was managing the reagent supply and stuff like that. To some degree, a lot of these skills then I think helped get me this Biorad job. The Biorad job though came again through networking. When I was at the Joint Genome Institute, I was taking those photography skills and those interpersonal skills, leading tours for people so that the public could see what taxpayer money was doing at the JGI as far as sequencing organisms. And in that process, I had met Biorad Laboratories education group because I helped them build basically a kit on doing DNA sequencing in my quote unquote spare time. And so they offered me this role, and it was right after I'd finished that major paper on the first basically full genome of a single microbial cell. And I was kind of looking at what our new prospects were at the JGI, and I was like, none of them really excite me. A lot of it's going to be automating this process that I just helped create. And I've done that before with other things I've done at JGI. And I see that these genomic technologies are happening so fast that we don't have an educated public about these tools. We're going to be putting ourselves in great risk for these tools getting inappropriately used. And I was also seeing that when I had people come to the JGI and I was trying to hire them into the lab, some of them wouldn't have basic lab skills. And they were from like four-year colleges like UC Berkeley. And I was like, man, glad I didn't go there. And so I was like, these are things I know we can teach at a younger age. You know what, I'll take this job, I'll go for it. So with this role, what I do is I primarily help educators bring biotechnology hands-on into their classroom. And a lot of it is troubleshooting problems. A lot of it is hands-on training. Biorad doesn't fulfill me entirely, and so I had to start a nonprofit on the side. And this was basically to help urban adults know more about local environmental, biodiversity, and social justice problems, because you guys don't quite vote yet. You vote with your money every day, so I am curious about you in that regards. But adults vote like literally, and they vote with their money all the time. So getting them informed about local things is really important. This led me down a giant citizen science, basically, rat hole, I would say, where I got really involved in a platform called iNaturalist, where you can go out and basically document organisms just using your cell phone. I have become obsessed with this. I'm at like 55,000 observations from all over the world. I've got collaborations because of this. I've seen almost 10,000 organisms. I've had people fly from New Zealand because of some of these observations to get critters that I'm picking up just at Lake Merritt in Oakland. There's like a new species of fungus being named that I found at Lake Merritt that's an STD on ladybugs. I've got like a PhD student who's going to do a giant project on this new genus of fungi that I found on our coast. I mean, the opportunities that you can do, get yourself involved in techniques just kind of by getting into the citizen science world is just mind-blowing. So I wanted to open that up for people. So locally, I started this Barcode the Lake project. So I live by Lake Merritt in Oakland. That's what's behind me. So this is an opportunity for anybody in my community to come in, learn how to basically extract DNA, amplify DNA using PCR, send it out for DNA sequencing, then do bioinformatics to help us describe all of the organisms that live in this very urban park. And just through the first couple organisms we sequenced, we already had stuff that was like brand new in GenBank, which tells you we don't know jack about biodiversity on this planet. And that's before like that single cell stuff, right? Like even these are large organisms that we can go and we can pick up. We still haven't characterized them. There's a lot of work to be done in order to understand just the biology right underfoot. But a lot of this comes down to being able to like organize your time, right? And so that was one of the questions that you guys had really frequently, is like, how do you keep a whole bunch of things going at once? And what it comes down to is building systems that allow you to manage and keep priorities. And so like back in the day, I used to literally have like a flip notebook like this in my pocket all the time. And this was like my go-to calendar. And then, you know, we got cell phones. And so, I mean, I try to calendar everything because that way I can autopilot. I don't have to like keep that on my head. Things was dang right. I'm like, oh crap, David's class right now. Got to get there. But then I have the more important one, I actually keep still like this, which are kind of like goals and to-do lists for the day. So before I go to bed at night, I write down what I want to get done the next day. Bam, I put that down. And just because you write it down at night, it's actually in your brain as you sleep. And so when you wake up, you're like focused to like get that done. And that helps me keep organized. So putting a calendar together, and basically like daily to-do lists. Those are like the two things I lean upon that are huge and allow me, I feel like, to accomplish a lot of stuff. The third one, and this one I really didn't realize until I ended up with the Biorad job, was finding roles that allow you to manage your own time. Because if you work a job that's hourly and they want you to be there all the time, you're just getting straight exchange, right? But a lot of you guys know that like that job, you could probably finish that job, the components of it, maybe in 20 minutes, not that full hour. And so if you can find roles that pay you based upon what your completed project is and not necessarily an exact exchange for your time, it also just allows you to be much more efficient because you're not just like waiting to like get through this time amount. So those kind of three things I think are the things that allow me to kind of get a lot done. You want to think about everything you do right now, everything you get involved in as a skill generating activity. Write those skills down like on what I call like my sloppy resume, which is basically a list of everything I've ever been involved in and the skills that I've kind of learned along the way. And the reason that's important is not so much that you've got a list you can go back to, but the process of doing that makes you think every time that you're like, do I want to go do this thing? What am I learning from it? What new thing am I going to learn from it? And it gets you in the habit about thinking that. So not only do you have this like list that maybe you could go back to at some point if you wanted, but it gets you in the process of everything that you take on. You're like, what am I going to learn from it? How might I benefit from it in, you know, ultimately my career or other portions of my life, you know, goals that I'm getting to. The Human Genome Project was the first attempt to go through and basically find the sequence of all the A, T, C's, and G's of the human in order. Basically make a blueprint per se of this really complex organism based on the molecular sequence. Because if you can look at that molecular sequence, you can understand how diseases arrive, what you could do maybe to kind of avert different things, why people have different characteristics, all of these types of things. So the United States government invested a ton of money in that because they thought that dumping $3 billion at this would probably get us to a point where we would have much better healthcare outcomes in the United States because we would have a much more fine-tuned understanding of how the human body worked. So that's why the Human Genome Project was kind of kickstarted per se. And then my interaction with it, like I said, was doing quality control of it, helping this production line that basically was doing the sequencing run, and then making new processes along the way. Yeah, I mean, especially when I came right out of college, right? That resume, it had the problem all beginner resumes have, which is a focus on my classes, my academics, where those job people, they're like, okay, great, you've got a pedigree, but what can you do? What's your skill set? And so I had a lot of jobs I applied to, and they would just call you back if you're lucky and say, oh, sorry, we found a better candidate. And if I asked them, they'd be like, oh, well, we wanted somebody with a little more experience. And experience is code word for, I want you to demonstrate you have that skill. And so those were the two things like I learned from that process was focus on skills and experience, like hands-on experience for resumes.